Hello, and welcome to today's roundtable, co-hosted by the Indigenous Journalists Association, our first under the new name, an AARP regarding preventing fraud and scams targeted at Indigenous communities. This issue is a major problem in the U.S. New AARP-sponsored research illuminates the vulnerability of Indigenous American communities to fraudulent activities, pointing towards a means of addressing the issue. This crisis, being especially fraught among Indigenous peoples, emphasizes the need for all of us to work together to reframe how we talk about and respond to fraud victimization, which we'll explore during our webinar today. Our panel moderator is IJA board member Shondiin Silversmith, Diné, award-winning Native journalist and Indigenous communities reporter for the Arizona Mirror. Her digital, print, and audio stories have been published by USA Today, the Arizona Republic, Navajo Times, the Ground Truth Project, and PRX's The World. Silversmith earned her bachelor's degree in journalism and mass communication in Boston before moving back to Arizona to continue reporting stories on Indigenous communities. Shondiin may take questions from the audience as time allows. Please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit a question. Shondiin, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Sterling. Yate, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Shondiin Silversmith, and I'm honored to be your moderator for this important webinar that's hosted by the Indigenous Journalists Association and AARP. Our two panelists today are Kathy Stokes and Mashell Sourjohn from AARP, and they'll lead us through an important discussion on the topic of fraud within Indigenous communities. So before we dive into this discussion and introduce the panelists, here are a few housekeeping items. Like Sterling mentioned, we are going to have a Q&A session with the panelists, and please submit the questions that you have in the Q&A tab, and please keep your comments and questions constructive and considerate to the topic at hand. The webinar is only going to run for an hour, so we'll do our best to stick to the schedule. But now, without further ado, let's get started. And each panelist is going to briefly introduce themselves and share their initial thoughts on the subject. We'll start with Kathy Stokes. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Shondiin, and thanks everybody for signing on today. This is really important information, so I'm glad you're hearing it straight from AARP. So let me first explain. AARP has a program called the Fraud Watch Network, and it's a nationwide program. We have 53 state offices, and a bunch of them are out there probably today in community with the message of fraud prevention. We also have really great information on our website. If you go to aarp.org/fraudwatchnetwork, you can find all the latest on today's scams and tactics. We have a scam tracking map there, and you can go and look and see what's being reported in your community. And importantly, we also support victims. So if you or someone you love has experienced fraud, or they're just not sure about something, you can call our helpline, 877-908-3360. You don't have to be of a certain age, and you don't have to be a member of AARP to take advantage of this opportunity. We have plenty more, and you can just go onto the Fraud Watch Network website to learn about it, but I hope you do take advantage of this really great free information. So earlier this year, our research team worked with some experts in the field and have come back with a report called The Fraud Experience in American Indian and Alaska Native Communities. They did it through focus groups and in-depth interviews, and it was a range of people of age, gender, geography, tribal affiliation. And it did reveal that a lot of the fraud that the general population experiences is much the same in what we see in Indigenous communities. But there were some differences. Specifically to Indigenous communities, we see sales of fake regalia and native art, fraudulent homeopathic products, and then impersonators that are posing as tribal electric utility companies and trying to say that you haven't paid a bill and you've got to pay it right away, or we're cutting off your gas for your electric today. I thought it was pretty interesting that none of the participants in the focus groups or the interviews knew a word in their language for scams or for fraud. However, most do agree that scams are crimes, although there was some question as to whether is it a crime if it's not stealing money, but stealing data. I thought that was interesting, and some even tried to suggest that maybe it's not a crime unless it's more than $500 or something like that. And I just want to point out there is fraud is a crime. No matter how much or little is stolen, whether it's data or money in whatever form of asset, it is a crime, full stop. And as mentioned at the beginning, we have this sort of tendency to blame victims for the fraud that they experience. You know, you can hear yourself, right? Well, how did you fall for that? Why did you answer the phone? You know, yeah, how did you get duped by that? It's the oldest trick in the book. How much money did you give them? We don't react that way when people experience other types of crimes, and we really shouldn't be here either. And our history of doing it has served to deprioritize fraud as a crime. So our law enforcement reaction is woefully insufficient. And a lot of that has to do with underreporting because of that shame that we feel as victims. And if it's not reported a lot, then law enforcement doesn't understand how bad the problem is, and they're not mounting a fulsome response. And that's something we all need to change. We have to understand that the fraud today is largely driven by transnational criminal enterprises. They've got money, they've got time, they've got employees, and they have a playbook. And that playbook is to get the target into a heightened emotional state, whether it's fear, panic, excitement, because when we're in that space in our brains, we can't sort of back out and access logical thinking. So it isn't something that just happens to people who are older and experiencing cognitive decline. That's like one of the biggest myths we have. However, when that older adult is the victim, they tend to lose more because they have more assets than a younger person would. So all of this is just really important to understand, you know, it's not the victim's fault. They didn't do something wrong. It's not that they didn't know something. It's that they were intentionally targeted by a transnational criminal enterprise. And so another thing I thought was really interesting about the focus group response was that they're like, okay, so fraudulent schemes appear through a bunch of channels, whether it's social media, online ads, emails, texts, face-to-face, right? That's where we should be communicating. All of those channels where that the criminals use, we should be using to get information in front of people. We also learned, and you may not be surprised, that Indigenous communities really want information and education from people within their own communities. Like AARP is great, but we can help the elders understand the fraud so that they can then talk to the community, but talking directly to the community won't be as impactful. They also pointed to local media sources. I think radio was top there, tribal social media accounts. And they're basically saying storytelling, sharing experience, weaving narratives that resonate with cultural traditions may be really effective. And also, given that American Indian reservations, rural Alaskan communities cover these very expansive geographic distances, that a communication strategy should include tribal Facebook pages, already mentioned, but also community events like powwows, conferences, grassroots distribution of flyers. Also, the research found that there's a strong knowledge of protective actions. They were talking about how they use strong and unique passwords. They use password managers. They don't answer calls that they don't recognize, which is also very important. They know not to click on links in email and text because you really can't trust those anymore. They've spoken about use of antivirus software, never sharing their social security number, only using peer-to-peer payment apps with people they know and trust. And I think one of the most important things that the community has told us, they share their knowledge. And that's probably the most important thing we can do at a grassroots level, is to talk about fraud. You know, the more we talk about it, the more it becomes part of sort of our own sort of ether. And we'll be reminded if somebody calls and claims that they're their tribal utility, and you have heard that because, you know, your cousin or your neighbor mentioned it the other day, you're far less likely to engage in that fraud. Data from 2019 tells us if you know about a specific scam, you're 80% less likely to engage with it. 80%. So that's why it's super important that as journalists, you're talking about the stories as they're happening, that when you talk about them, you refer to them as having a crime, it being a crime and it being perpetrated by a criminal. Quite often we see headlines that like, older lady duped of $30,000. That's the headline. Well, why couldn't it be older woman or criminal steals older woman's life savings? You know, focus on the crime, the criminal, you know, go back to the tribal authorities and say, well, hey, what are you doing about this fraud? You know, or go to Facebook if you can get someone to talk to you there and say, hey, what are you doing about this scam that's happening all over our community? And start to agitate for change. We need to do that, or you know, we're not going to beat this battle. Education is not going to solve the problem for us, but it is a huge piece of it. And so I would just appreciate that you keep writing about it, and whatever you learn that's new, share on your social media channels, share with friends and family, because that's a really good way that we're going to sort of essentially inoculate our communities. And Mashell, you're going to have some conversation about this. I think maybe we're going to do a little bit of a Q&A kind of thing.
Sure, absolutely. That's Jazz, don't go. Yeah, so I think some of the key findings that we saw, as Kathy mentioned, but were many did express a need for education about the latest frauds and scams, and many were worried about our elders, particularly in our community. I think one of the participants stated that the elders, they have to learn about it and what it is first. You just can't say that's a scam, don't engage in that. You just really have to explain to them what it is and what to look out for. And I think that's where AARP's, our Fraud Watch Network resources really come in handy to be able to break down, what those scams are, how they work, how these con artists work in our community, and then what we need to do to mitigate it. And I think what's so important about this study is that, fraud impacts people's emotional, financial, and overall well-being. And prior to embarking on this study from AARP, there was no other organization that had published a study on fraud experience in Indigenous communities. So understanding the total impact that fraud has allows us to really make better informed decisions on who fraud is impacting on our peoplehood, and create strategies to mitigate it and help prevent it from happening in the future. So, for example, some participants expressed concerns that elders in our communities they felt that they were particularly vulnerable to fraud, and that they worried that older adults have less familiarity with technology, and that they're more trusting and have a lack of access to some of the education and resources. And I actually had the privilege of sitting on a couple of these interviews in the background. And one of our interviewees was a younger lady. She expressed deep concern of our elders being targeted, and particularly with access to technology, new phones and tablets and home computers. So as a result, I'm one of those people out in the community every day talking about how to avoid frauds and scams here in Oklahoma. And but as a result, she within her tribal nation became the trusted source of information and to get assistance. So in the past, as an organization, we were always thinking, let's go to the elders and train our elders on this information because they're wise friends and fierce defenders, and we'll arm them with the information and they can go out and educate. But this study helped us really craft new approaches to our education, and that we're starting to recruit, younger generations to go out and educate our communities on what the latest frauds and scams are. Here in Oklahoma, we partnered with the Oklahoma City Indian Missionary Conference and the National Urban Indian Family Coalitions to purchase tablets for urban Native American elders. And then we brought in a tech specialist from the Sovereignty School. And then we encouraged our urban elders to bring in their grandchildren with them to sit next to them so they can kind of teach them as we were going along. And it's really become a community event, and it's become a multi-generational event. And so this study is really also helping us as we go out and engage new volunteers in how we go about teaching about frauds and scams.
It's really important that that education include how to stay safe on the tablet, right? There are so many great programs getting tablets, laptops into people's hands, but excluding all the important stuff you need to know about how to keep yourself safe.
And our elders, they talked about that. They said they were so thankful for the tablet, but they were more thankful for us taking the opportunity to teach them how to operate it and then how to stay safe on it, because that was their biggest worry, was how do I stay safe on this tablet?
One of the things that both of you mentioned is that Indigenous communities experience fraud the same way as other communities, but you said there are some unique instances that are geared towards Indigenous communities. What are some examples of the scams that are impacting these Indigenous communities, and how can they become more aware of them and be mindful of them and know what to look for?
Yeah, so the ones that we heard of through the research, fake sales of regalia that's not legitimate native art. It's very similar to the general population, just fake sales. You go online, you're on Facebook, and you see an ad for those Ray-Bans that you really want to buy for your grandson. You're like, oh my gosh, they're 50% off here, they're 70% off here. And you click and you link and you go to buy something, and you give them your credit card information, and you either receive nothing or you receive something that is of no value. And it's a real challenge, because if you receive something, that is hard to prove to your credit card issuer that it was fraudulent. Homeopathic products is another area, and we see this all over the place with miracle cures for things. It happens to be homeopathic in the Indigenous community. And then also the tribal utility companies who are calling, it's not really them, right? They're calling and saying, hey, you haven't paid your bill for 3 months, and we're on our way over, and we're going to cut your heat, or we're going to cut your air at a time when it's probably the hottest or the coldest day. And it, again, like we were talking about, you get into that state of, oh my gosh, I have to keep the heat on. I have my great grandchild here or something. And you just do whatever they say with the intent of protecting your family. And they know it works, and that's what they do.
We also saw, one of our participants said, they stated, if you know people who make regalia, there's so many scam artists out there, especially on Facebook. So they reported they were seeing a lot of scams on there. I know I belong to a ribbon skirt Facebook group, and almost every day someone's posting, hey, these are my skirts, someone else is representing, trying to sell my skirts. And so we're seeing, quite a bit of that. And then sadly, I think what surprised me that we also saw in our community was offers of jobs to lure people into another community that often falls to human trafficking. So We are seeing quite a bit of the social media scams, and then also just like other government scams, but we're also seeing imposter scams from organizations, or people trying to represent that trying to get at tribal benefits. So I'm a citizen of Muscogee Nation, and whenever the pandemic hit and the COVID distribution funds were being distributed, con artists set up a website that looked a lot like our tribal benefits program. And so it's just keeping an eye on that as well.
What are some ways that people can stay vigilant and be able to spot and avoid these types of scams?
It's so much about sharing what you know. One of the things the AARP makes available is a bi-weekly alert. And you can get it by email or a text, and it takes a specific scam and talks about how in our current world it's being undertaken. And it's just a simple read. And some of them that come through you probably already know about, but you scan through it and hear the latest. And let that be a reminder that fraud is out there, and also a reminder that you want to pass it on, get it in front of other people. I mean, if we could have people that are in community together, whether it's getting your hair cut, mine's a little too short this Saturday, or restaurants, anywhere that people commune, try to engage in these conversations so that we sort of normalize it. So we're not, hiding because we don't want to talk about it, because what if that happens to me? I'm going to be so embarrassed. But share the knowledge.
We at AARP, I mean, we know that if you can spot a scam, you can stop a scam. And through our AARP Fraud Watch Network, we have many free resources available to help you understand. We have these great handbooks, like I mentioned, that go through, what these scams are, how they work, if you have been a victim of a scam, how to get assistance and help. And then we also do have an incredible hotline where people can call at 877-908-3360. And they can speak with a specialist, a trained specialist, to kind of help them understand if they are being targeted for a scam, and if they have been, what they need to do to get assistance and report it as well. And then we also, as Kathy mentioned, I think it's really important that we get these resources in the hands of, educators, tribal leaders in our tribal nations, and so it can be shared widely. We at AARP, we don't charge for any of these resources, and it's just important that we get this information out there.
Great. And one of the ways that both of you mentioned is that when this impacts somebody, they often don't feel like they can report it due to the stigmatism behind reporting fraud and scams and how it impacts them. So where can journalists go to kind of get facts and more data about frauds and scams, but also what are some ways that they can respectfully report on these things so that they can raise awareness about what's happening without implementing, like you said, that shame or that embarrassment behind the stigmatism of being a victim of these frauds and scams?
I'm really glad you brought that up. Thank you. The AARP Fraud Watch Network that I mentioned before, a great resource for information. The Federal Trade Commission is sort of the federal agency of record on fraud. And if you just Google FTC Tableau, they have all these data visualizations, and you can pull up Oklahoma and see what kind of scams have been happening in the prior quarter or the prior year. So that's all pretty interesting stuff. And we're actually at AARP, we're leading a movement on changing this narrative. And we're talking to consumers, but we're also talking to professional audiences like what we're talking about today. We're building out some resources. You can check out aarp.org/words matter. We've got some short videos that sort of get to the why of why we need to be talking about this differently and thinking about it differently.
And then we also have our great resources at aarp.org/FraudWatch Network. Through our AARP Public Policy Institute, you can find some great research and data there. And then I highly encourage everyone just to reach out to your local state AARP representative to get more localized information and support and resources. And you can find those contacts at aarp.org/states.
And part of the research that ARE published is that when it comes to navigating these scams, the research mentioned that a few were aware of the specific resources. So how can people who are not a part of the AARP network become more aware of the resources that they do have available for them? Because often I think there's a misconception that you have to be over the age of 50 to be a part of the AARP network, but scams and frauds happen to anybody at any age range. So what are some of those specific resources that Indigenous communities can rely on when it comes to understanding what fraud is and what scams are and how they can navigate through these situations?
I'll let Mashell refer to some how it happens at the state and local level, but the AARP website we talked about, aarp.org/FraudWatch Network, really great resource. You can sign up to join free webinars. We do, so the benefit of having a membership of 38 million people is that we have the resources to get information in front of everybody. It doesn't have to just be for the paying members. So everything that we make available at the state level, at the federal level, is all free to everybody. The one big benefit of being a member is getting our AARP bulletin and AARP magazine. These are print publications, and I know with the bulletin anyway, it always has a section on the latest in fraud, and I know that people that read that get a lot out of it.
Yeah, and we and here in the States, we get this information out there. We have like one-pager PDFs that go over each, one of the scams. We have, of course, our FraudWatch handbook, FraudWatch Alert Handbook, and then we also do have our AARP Veterans Edition. Native Americans serve at a higher rate than most any other ethnicity, and so we want to make sure that these get in the hands of our veterans as well. But here in the state of Oklahoma, we have free AARP kits that we put together that individuals can go and just go online and order, and we mail them directly to them. There's some organizations that go out and some of the Title VI programs that just order our materials in bulk and then hand them out to their members. And so we're happy to provide those. It doesn't matter if it's 2 or 200. We just want to get this information out to the public. And then also, as we mentioned earlier, it's really important that this information's heard from people within the community. And so we want to help. We have great PowerPoint presentations. We provide training for journalists and then just everyday heroes that are going out and sharing this information and to be able to with talking points and to be able to share this information out there. But we would love to have new volunteers, and we would love to share this information.
And how can more community members get involved in being able to provide those type of resources for not only Indigenous communities, but those small rural areas as well?
Yeah, just go to aarp.org/states and look up your local AARP contact, or just reach out to me. I'm happy to work and making sure that you get to the correct person within your state. But just reach out to them and let them know I am interested in being a Fraud Watch Network volunteer. I want to provide these great sources to my community.
And we have, I want to
Okay.
say it's like, I'm sorry, we have like 40,000 volunteers, not just all Fraud Watch Network, but there are all kinds of opportunities to engage with your community on education that's important to the 50+ community, Social Security, Medicare, livable communities, fraud. So lots of opportunities for anyone interested.
We also did see in the study, one of the participants stated that their tribal nations regularly send out alerts on their social media on some of the scams that are happening within their community. And so we would love to work with those tribal nations and their communications department and providing some resources that they can push out as well.
And why do you think it's so hard to get people to want to report when they're victims of fraud and scams?
Well, a big part of it is that shame, that sense that, oh my God, I did something wrong. I'm so embarrassed. My adult kids are going to think I can't take care of myself. And they just don't want people to know. They want it to go away. It's also not clear to many people that it's a crime and that they should report it as such. And sadly, when you call law enforcement, sometimes the person that answers the phone is very ill-informed and will say, oh, that's not a crime, that's a civil matter. Or you gave them your money, there's nothing we can do about it. Or still like, well, yeah, but that's happening from another country, there's nothing we can do about that. And all of that is the wrong response, and we're working to try to get to the right response. But in the meanwhile, when you report to law enforcement, if they try to push back to say, look, I insist, I want a record, a criminal record of this crime. You know, some states are looking at creating victim restitution funds where, you know, some victims of fraud might be able to get some money back that they lost. And what better way to prove that it happened to you than to have a police report?
I do think it's so important that, as Kathy mentioned earlier, that we really reframe how these criminals are targeting our citizens, and you know, because we know if when people they feel more empowered when they're not being victim blamed, and so they feel more empowered and confident to report that financial crime. So that's really important. And then secondly, I think throughout Indian country, we already face a lot of criminal jurisdictional issues in our nation, and so some may not feel like that they know where to turn to report of being a victim of fraud. And so at the AARP Fraud Watch Network, again, we do have those trained volunteers that you can call the hotline and speak with someone, and they can guide them on how and where to report it.
And from your expertise and your experience working with different journalists and media, what are some best practices that reporters who are coming into this type of information and want to be able to do a story about them? What are some best practices that they could follow, or some best avenues they could take in fleshing out a story like this?
Yeah, again, great question. I think that, you know, the reporting that we see now generally is, here's a scam, here's how somebody got duped, talk to a fraud expert and say, this is what happened and this is how do you protect yourself. And there's a place for that. But I think more importantly, we really need to lean in on the narrative, on the story, what happened to this victim and what impacts has that had on the victim, their family members, their economic security, their health, their emotional well-being. You know, families are ripped apart with this, and we don't really talk about that. And part of the narrative change is to help children of older adults, when they experience this, understand to react with empathy. It's really about spreading the message that, look, this is a crime, this isn't the victim's fault. You know, treat them with dignity and empathy and the respect that they deserve. And, you know, chase the story. You know, so much of fraud today is happening on social media, and social media is not saying anything about it, but maybe the journalists could put some pressure on those social media platforms and say, look, we're hearing this all the time. People are losing everything. What are you doing about it? Calling whatever law enforcement is there locally in your jurisdiction. Hey, this is happening. What are you doing about it? And then engage. If they say they're not doing anything about it, you can have the conversation. I'm like, this is probably the biggest crime in this country right now. We're never going to look at it that way. In the UK, they call fraud the #1 crime, and they're taking a lot of actions that we're not there yet with. But I would submit it's probably the biggest crime in this country. But since it's so underreported and deprioritized, we're never going to hear people talking about it like that.
Mashell, do you want to add anything?
I mean, and I think just doing stories on some of these frauds and scams that we're seeing in our community, and getting to the heart of how these con artists are working and how the scam works. We see so many of the grandparent scam, and of course with AI now, a lot of talk about AI. We've heard that it's these con artists are getting your voice off of the computer and then being able to, and of course with social media, a lot of times it has all of our family members on there, and so they know who to contact and who to play that voiceover for. And so it's just important that these stories are being told, and how they work. Like mentioning the lady earlier that said that it's doing the education on not just saying this is a scam, but our citizens really need to know what is it that makes it a scam and how does it work.
Great. Well, I think it was a really interesting study to go through, and I really hope and recommend that all the participants and attendants in the room take time to read through it and see kind of the key findings in how frauds and scams are impacting Indigenous communities and the ways that AARP has been able to flesh out this research. What are some from your experience, Mashell, because you did say that you sat in on some of the interviews for this research, what are some of the main things that you were able to take away from this experience, being able to hear people talk about how fraud has such an impact on them and the ways that they navigate through these types of situations?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we continue to see, a lot of the same scams that, we're seeing across nationwide. But I mean, for me, as someone that goes out and does education, I think that just engaging all community members on how we go out about and educate the public on what these latest frauds and scams are. And as I mentioned, earlier, that our always forethought was, let's work with our elders because they're the people that go and seek the information from. But particularly when it comes to technology, I think it's really important that we engage all generations. And be open to the information that's out there to be able to share widely.
Just on that point, scams don't just happen to older people. That's what we make assumptions about, and that's how we talk about it. But there are more younger people that report fraud losses every year to the Federal Trade Commission than older people. The big catch is when it's an older adult, they lose so much more.
Great. Well, I wanted to see if any of the attendees had any questions or comments that they wanted to make, and if they want to submit any questions, they can add it too. So one of the questions that is coming up is in terms of Medicaid fraud. Does AARP have any situations where Medicaid fraud or health fraud comes up in terms of their membership, but also how they choose to communicate with other people? Because one of the biggest scams and frauds happening right now in the state of Arizona is how there are addiction treatment centers that are popping up that are targeting Indigenous communities specifically for their health, Medicaid and healthcare fraud.
I'm more familiar with Medicare fraud,
Mhm.
and then health fraud generally, but it's ubiquitous. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services would say that somewhere around $60 billion every year is lost to fraud, waste, and abuse, and that's probably a small percentage. It's a big problem. I'm sure you've heard of people who get that phone call saying they're from Medicare and they're eligible for a genetic test to determine if they have a specific propensity toward a bad disease, and they say, well, if you don't take it, we're going to cut your Medicare off. So of course, they're going to send you a kit, you're going to take it, but it's not going to a legitimate lab. Or even if it does, the lab is behaving illegitimately with the provider who prescribed that, because everything has to be prescribed by a doctor. And they're billing Medicare and Medicaid for things that aren't even legitimate. So there's a lot of it out there. I think a lot of it also has to do with people calling on the phone, pretending they're affiliated with Medicare or Medicaid. They're not going to call you, unless you have an existing situation and they're calling you back about something. Anytime someone says they're from a government agency, they're not being, they're lying, let's say.
Did any type of, through the research that you were able to do in terms of the fraud experience in Indigenous communities, was health care fraud a part of that conversation, or did that come up at any time during the research, or concerns from the people that you were able to have participate in the research?
I didn't see that, Mashell. Did you?
No, I did not.
Interesting. Okay.
I would say quite often health fraud happens and the victim doesn't ever even know it. The losses are usually borne by the agency. And if the thing though is, like, if you have an experience where, let's say your Medicare or Medicaid number was stolen and sold on the dark web and somebody else used it to get health treatment, that messes up your own records. And so that could be a real problem, and you won't know it until, sometime later, and then you have to unwind all of that. It's a big problem.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And is healthcare fraud and Medicaid fraud a part on AARP's radar?
Yeah, we have this really great resource on the website we were talking about. You can go to it by a quick link, aarp.org/FRC. That's for Fraud Resource Center. We probably have 80 different tip sheets in there, and they're just a quick read of Medicare fraud, Medicare payment fraud, Medicare card fraud, online tech support scams, romance scams, all the things, grandparent scams, all the things that you're hearing about or may hear new. We should have that covered.
It's great for our journalists out there because there's scarily a lot listed.
Great, that's good to know. That's such a valuable resource for everybody to be aware of. Well, we have about a little over 15 minutes left, and I wanted to give both you and Mashell, Kathy and Mashell, a chance to add any closing remarks or any highlights over our conversation that they wanted to talk about. Go ahead, ladies, if you want to.
Yeah,
take it away.
Thanks, Shondiin. It's just so important to communicate that the victim is not the problem. The criminal, the crime, those are the problems. We need to understand that the victim didn't have anything to do with it. I mean, sure, we all have a responsibility to do what we know to do to protect ourselves, but there's so much happening around us where we don't even know that we're susceptible. Like, you can go and set up a social media account, and there are all these privacy settings, but they aren't on, right? You have to know they're there and turn them on, so you can't blame someone for not having that shut down because they didn't even know about it. So, understand that there's so much that feeds into the problem, technology that is not secure by design or by default. Blaming, deprioritizing, all of these things come together. It is a real epidemic. And finally, I would say, when you talk about the criminal, talk about them as criminals, perpetrators. Fraudster is just a little too cute. Scammer even sounds a little too cute. So if you can just rely on using the terms that really describe what's happening, the crime, the criminal, the perpetrator, that will help everybody better understand that this is a crime.
And I would just say, just know that we at AARP, we have some wonderful resources available to help, craft some of the stories that you may be doing, and then as well as provide links for further education in the community. And again, those are at aarp.org/FraudWatch Network. If you'd like to reach out to somebody locally, just contact us at aarp.org/states. And then if you want to get some of these materials into the hands of your local communities, just let us know. We're happy to help.
Do you often have tribal communities reach out for you to have presentations within their community, or do they have like their local AARP members do it?
We do. So nationally, we work with the Title VI directors and get on their calls. They do regular calls. We work with them, and of course, at the account there. And then we also, this particular presentation on the study that we did, we actually did a whole session training on it at their Title VI National Conference, and along with how to contact local staff, as well as ordering materials and resources. And so we do work with tribal nations and letting them know that these resources are available out there. And then, of course, we're just so thrilled to always work with the Indigenous Journalists Association and provide all these resources as well.
Great. One of the things as a journalist, it's always interesting to see, do you have data sets available for them to look through in terms of finding out the statistics behind this type of fraud within the AARP network, or how they can put visuals to this type of fraud?
I think the best resource for that right now is the Federal Trade Commission, and even that, it's a drop in the bucket. Looking at data from 2022 on reported fraud, the losses were $9 billion. The FTC itself just said a few weeks ago that they think that somewhere between 2 and 6% of people report. So, do the math in your head, because I can't. $9 billion only being 2 to 6% of what it is. But they have the that tableau I talked about. So for known fraud, there's a lot of neat things you can do to slice and dice the data. Again, just do a web search, FTC Tableau, TABLEAU.
Great. Do we have any additional questions for our panelists? We have some time left. One of the things that I was curious about that I think often is not talked about, as you mentioned, is that fraud impacts everybody. It doesn't, and oftentimes there is that misconception that it only targets elders, but I've been a victim of fraud, and I know people who are my age have been victim of frauds as well. And some of the most common types of frauds geared towards people in their 30s or 20s and 30s are sort of really like rent-based or housing-based and stuff. Have you seen that type of concern within Indigenous communities, like housing scams or rental scams? Because a large population of Indigenous people do live in urban areas.
As a part of the study, we did see a couple of participants that reported, rental scams. property scams as some of the scams that they had been targeted for.
And we have resource tip sheets on those kind of scams as well.
Great, great. Well, ladies, do you have anything else you want to add or talk about?
We'll just end by sharing one more time some of our resources, aarp.org/fraudwatchnetwork, and that helpline number, 877-908-3360. It's available 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time, Mondays through Fridays, and you'll get to talk to a human.
Great. Mashell?
Yeah, you know, again, thank you guys so much for spotlighting this really important information and getting this important study out. And again, really, if you need resources from AARP, we have those available. If people want the educational materials, we do have all of our wonderful Fraud Watch Network materials available. If we also do have our AARP Senior Planet, where we provide free computer classes online, as well as we also have a toll-free number for them as well. And I'll provide that to you guys. It's 888-713-3495, where people can call. And so if they need to know how to update their, security system, we at AARP will provide those at no cost for seniors 50 plus.
Great. And I know that the full research is available at aarp.com, and it's underneath your policy and research tab. So any journalists who want to read through the entire research and see all of the key findings, that's where you'll be able to find it. And I know that the best way to reach out to getting more information from AARP as a journalist is going through your media contacts and through your PIO, which is media@aarp.com, right?
And it's aarp.org.
.org. There we go. Thank you.
People get confused because AARP is like a zillion different things. The .org is where Mashell and I are is in the social mission space. There is a for-profit part, but that's the folks that are getting all the great discounts for our members. So.
Great. All right. Well, I thought this was a really productive conversation because it's not something that's highlighted enough within any community, and being able to have these conversations surrounding frauds and scams and how they impact people on that personal level, like you said, allows people to start looking at it without the stigmatism behind it, and allows journalists to start having this idea of how they can properly report on these communities rather than extracting information. They can work with communities to start showing their stories and how it directly impacted them. I think you pointing out how even just a difference in headlines or even approaching these stories, it would be beneficial because it is a crime. And when you approach these in that matter, it does change the perspective on everything. And I think whenever I come across stories or different news articles about fraud, it usually is, it's usually victim blaming, and it doesn't really highlight exactly like, well, this was a crime. These individuals targeted these people and extracted information and ended up scamming them out of hundreds of dollars. But I think one of the important things that you highlighted is that within this research, you noted how a lot of people don't think that anything under like $500 or under $200 is considered a scam. Why do you, I guess one of my final questions is like, why do you think that is such a misconception? Is that if it has to meet a certain dollar amount, or it has to meet these certain little identities to be considered fraud?
We've been talking about scams so long as something that the victim brought on themselves, so we don't think about it any other way. And it's not our fault. I mean, it's just the way we've been talking about it, and we got used to it. What we didn't realize is the impact that's having to deprioritize it and on even understanding that it's a crime. So that's why this whole discussion about changing the narrative is so important. Look, we've done this in the past as a society. You know, in the 80s, that's when I was growing up, and I remember the conversations about, you know, a rape case, and my parents going, yeah, well, what was she doing alone at night anyway? Or what was she wearing? And, you know, we don't do that anymore, most of us. So you can change a narrative. We just need to be aware that what we're doing is causing harm and then fix it.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a valid point. And one of the goals as a journalist is not to do harm. And I think when you look at topics like this where victims are a part of the narrative, you have to be mindful of how you communicate with them, how you are going to share their perspective, but also like do your research, reach out to all the other entities. And I think that is just, it falls back on the basics of journalism, of making sure that you contact everybody you need to a part of this topic. And it's important. And I think when, as part of this conversation, you noted that sometimes it's hard to even see if police or any of these people are going to take these matters seriously. But yeah, I think it's interesting to hear and read through all of your findings in terms of how fraud has hit Indigenous communities across the country. And I appreciate that this research came out this year. I think it's really interesting and very insightful.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Yes, I appreciate you, Mashell.
Yeah. All right. Does anybody have anything else they want to add? Sterling, Justine, do you have any other housekeeping things that we need to touch on as we start to wrap up?
Well, we should have a recording up here pretty soon, so please look out for that if you want to refer this to anyone, and we'll have like a live recording living on our Facebook page. Thank you, Shondiin.
Great. All right. Well, I thought this was very productive, and I enjoyed being able to have a conversation with both Mashell and Kathy. Kathy, I think, and we touched on a lot of important topics and went through a really good portion of what the research was about, and especially highlighting the key findings from it. So I do recommend all of the attendees take the time to read through it and get a better understanding of how this impacts Indigenous communities across the U.S.
Well, thank you, Shondiin, and thank you again to our panelists. We appreciate their time and expertise. This concludes today's virtual roundtable. We'll see you next time.